Thanks very much. I'm not sure what it means either, to be honest with you. I'm the editor-at-large of Wired magazine. It's one of my jobs, and as part of that job, I'm meant to be living 6 months in the future. And many of you will be happy to know that in about 5 months' time, PowerPoint is going to be made illegal. So I don't have any slides to show you. And I'm just going to talk to you about futurism, really. The PowerPoint joke is my one futurism joke. It used to be very easy to make predictions about the future. If you read science fiction from the 50s or the 60s, everybody had a very good idea of where the future was going to be. We would be living on cities on the moon, or we would have flying cars, or we'd have jetpacks, or we'd be eating lunch in the pill form or wearing paper clothes. The future was very, very easy to understand, and we could make predictions for our lives. We could make plans. We could make 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plans. It was very easy. But today, the world is extraordinarily weird. The science fiction writer William Gibson has a quote that is usually trotted out at conferences, which is, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." We're living in a time of massive revolution and a time of massive change. And I don't know about you, but I'm quite tired. The revolution that we're living through is undoubtedly an IT revolution, an information revolution, and it's the people in this room today and the people that you work with who are driving this revolution forward. And in this time of crisis and this time of great change, it is the IT industry and the clusters around Europe specifically who will be the route out of the crisis. But we have a problem. We have a huge problem. The problem is that the revolution itself, the thing that we spend our time talking about and selling and doing and pushing forward, is fundamentally ununderstandable by the people we have to sell it to, by the people who are currently in charge, by politicians and decision makers around the world. This isn't unusual. Think of the major trends, the major drivers of trends in our industry. Take Moore's Law, for example. I'm sure everybody in the room knows about Moore's Law, but I'll refresh your memory. Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, in about 1958, I think it was, had a look at the statistics that were coming out of his chip plant and realized that the number of transistors on a chip for the same price doubled roughly every 12 months. And he said, this is an interesting trend, maybe this will continue. And he formulated an idea called Moore's Law, that for the same price, computing power will double every 12 to 18 months. Or, the same amount of computing power will halve in price every 12 to 18 months. And that was in 1958, and it turns out that it's been true ever since, and for all intents and purposes will probably continue for another 20 years. Now this makes our jobs and our lives very, very exciting. But it makes politicians and administrators' jobs basically impossible. Now one of my jobs is I'm an advisor to the British Prime Minister, and David Cameron, who came into power about, whatever it was, 1.5 years ago, and he had an iPhone 3GS in his pocket. The slightly rubbish version of this. If you think of an iPhone 3GS in his pocket, imagine that Cameron's going to have 2 terms as Prime Minister. In 8 years' time, or 6.5 years' time, when he leaves Downing Street for the final time, the phone in his pocket will be either 64 times as powerful as the one that was in his pocket when he became Prime Minister, or if he has the same phone, it'll be 1/64th of the price. Which means it'll be about 20 quid, which means that effectively it'll be free with cornflakes. Take a regular civil servant in any country. They get into their trainee job when they're 21, they graduate, they go into government, they become an administrator, a policy person. By the time they're in their early 40s, and they're in some position of relevance, some position of influence, the computer on their desk will be 8,000 times as powerful as the one they had the first day they worked for the government. The year after that will be 16,000 times. And the year after that, 32. The fundamental architecture of the business that we're in makes it almost unbearably ununderstandable by the people we have to sell it to. The operational tempo of the pre-digital world is fundamentally unsuited to modernity. This, I would say, is our biggest problem, the macro problem that confronts us all. We can talk about smart cities, we can talk about open data, we can talk about all of that, but the implications of those technological revolutions are so huge and change so rapidly that for your average middle-aged government executive, government theorist or politician, they're practically alien technologies. And we see this both in the public and the private sector in everything. In strategy, in procurement. Procurement is a very good one, just as an aside. UK government, if you want to sell something to them, high-tech stuff, you have to have at least 3 years accounts. And yet at the same time, the government wants to work with lots of startups. You kind of can't. And it also shows itself in security policy. There isn't a country in the Western world which hasn't had recently elected politicians attempting to censor the internet. We love the internet apart from all the things that we don't like about it. Please can we stop it? Please can we roll back the past 10 years? So our major problem as an IT industry isn't one of partnerships with each other, really. Because we all know each other and we all know each other's language. Our major problem is educating the rest of the world about what we do and about the implications, social and political and economic, about the technologies that you're all responsible for. There are some things that we do and we have done which don't help with this. The first one is that we have, over the past 20 years, created a sort of geek ghetto. We have our own language, we have our own special way of talking to each other, which is completely incomprehensible to everybody else. And we kind of did it on purpose. 20 years ago, many of us were at school, for example, maybe even before that. And we were the nerds and the geeks. And we had to stick together and use our own special language to talk to each other so that we wouldn't get bullied. But now it turns out we're running the world. Who knew? And we need to translate that stuff to other people. But we need to do it in a language which shows the all-encompassing nature of the technology that we're selling. And at the moment, the language which is used by the IT industry is massively, massively male. If you sit back and think about it, it's actually kind of pervy. It's all about market penetration. It's all about domination. It's all about growth and enlargement and thrusting into new markets. Freud would have a field day. It's fundamentally off-putting. It's fundamentally off-putting for a couple of reasons. But I think the main one is that we face ourselves a very interesting generation gap. The generation gap that we face is really before and after 1989. Apart from the notable people in this room, you can pretty much split the world into people who did the majority of their education and their intellectual development before 1989 and after 1989. Let me run it through you. Before 1989, the vast majority of people in the West, intellectual development was based on the Cold War, us versus them. It was very stable. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. 1990, Germany is reunited, and 6 weeks later, the first web servers turned on, a couple hundred miles to the south. And instantly, everything changes. And you see all of the things that have happened since the web being turned on, all of the mindset changes, all of these new words, all of these new things, all of the industries which were destroyed and renewed by the internet touching them. It's happened since 1989. And anybody under the age of about 40 has spent the vast majority of their intellectual development living in a post-web world. But all of the senior politicians, all of the senior business people have spent the vast majority of their intellectual development in a Cold War, pre-web world, where we see networks, they see hierarchies. Where we see ask permission, ask forgiveness, they say seek permission. It's a fundamental shift. And it's getting worse. Because administrators and politicians now are having to deal with a world which is basically ignoring them. Anybody under the age of 25, any awesome coder, any great designer, anybody who you might want to employ, you're going to have to fight for in a way which is fundamentally different to the way that was expected when I was that age. When I was that age, I would leave school and it was expected of me that I would join a corporate trainee scheme or something like that. You know, I'm going to be a trainee manager at Marks and Spencer's. I'd work my way up through the hierarchy and get a gold watch and retire, garden for a couple of years and die of relief. Whereas now, the idea of having a job for a big company, for the talented under 25s, is completely weird. They don't want a job, they want work. They want interesting projects. And they're talented and will move to where the work is. These ideas are shifting society because of the technology that you're responsible for selling in. It's kind of your fault. And because of the euro and because of the crisis and because of the political situations of the past 10 years, the post-9/11 world, a massive mistrust of institutions has arisen. So we find ourselves in a hugely chaotic world, entrusting our future to a political class who are fundamentally confused by the present. This isn't a situation that is very tenable. So, what can we do about it? Apart from all of the commercial deals and all of the other advice that you've heard today, I think the thing that would be most helpful to the IT industry in Cork, the IT industry in Ireland, the IT industry in Europe and the world, will be to recognize that the stuff that we make and the stuff that we sell at a very basic societal level changes everything. And, if used properly, can change the world for good, for huge good. We have enormous problems facing us over the next 10 years. The financial crisis, through to climate change, through to education, immigration, everything. Huge societal problems. And it is only through the new technologies that we're going to come out the other side. But if you're trying to sell those new technologies and the benefits of those technologies to people who fundamentally don't understand the world that we live in, then we are doomed to fail. So the biggest collaboration that you can make the biggest connections that you can make, the most important partnerships you can make, aren't with each other, but with the politicians and the administrators and society around you. We need to dedicate ourselves over the next few years to educating and explaining and translating the fundamental truths that our technologies bring to society to the people who are running the countries that we live in. If we don't quietly and humbly, and without this talk of penetration and disruption, if we go to them and we gently show them the fundamentals of Moore's law and algorithms and the uncensorableness of the internet, and all of the other fundamental things that we understand as digital people, if we go to them and we translate the conversations that we have in this room into languages that they can understand, then all of these great ideas, open data, smart cities, growth, disruption to industries and so on, will become true. But if we don't, if we continue to be partnering only with ourselves, if we continue to only look inwards, if we continue to only be an IT community, in a cluster, in our own ghettoized neighborhood, then the people who can make decisions, the really powerful people, will continue to make the wrong ones. We're at a tipping point right now where things could get very, very bad in the next few years. Or things could get very, very good. And I think the IT industry and motivated people like yourselves can tip us towards the good. But only if the next partnership you make is just somebody who really just doesn't understand what you're saying. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thanks, Ben. I will open it to questions. Just here.
Thanks. Alan Cooney from EMC. Question for Ben. You were talking about the stuff we sell, open data, etc. Do you think, as we move forward with things like big data and analytics, there could be a social backlash against the privacy being taken away from people?
Yeah. Yes. So there's a couple of reasons. One is that we have to be very, very careful that this big data isn't primarily used to sell people stuff. You know, and so I can absolutely see it. The first big social backlash will be against Facebook, because there's a social contract that we have that many people have with Facebook at the moment, which is, I'll give you lots of personal information. I know you're going to advertise to me, but I find the service that you provide in return for that to be very useful. But Facebook has this habit of becoming extraordinarily creepy. And so there is a possibility that at some point they'll just go one creepy step a bit too far, and there'll be a backlash. There'll be a backlash against it. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is about smart cities, which is I'm slightly worried that smart city technology, and this isn't necessarily an IBM issue, but it's certainly a thing that many smart city vendors, if you read the marketing material of smart city technologies, it comes from a cultural place which isn't necessarily relevant to the city that's buying the technology. So as an example, I was in Denmark a couple of months ago in Aarhus, which is the second city of Denmark, and they're just instigating a huge smart city project. Now Aarhus is a place, it's a little harbour town, but it has the most pavement cafes per capita than anywhere in Denmark. It's a great statistic they told me. And so their cultural values are based around drinking coffee and watching pretty girls on bicycles. That's what they want to optimize, right? That's the thing they want to optimize. Whereas smart cities are based around optimizing getting people from their suburbs to a cubicle in a tower block in Texas, or wherever it was that technology was based. So, and the two don't necessarily match. And I am worried that there's a homogeneity of optimization. It's the longest sentence I've ever said. The homogeneity of optimization, which is unhealthy, and that before you, with smart cities and all this open data stuff, there is a realization that any number you put on the wall is going to go up. Anything you measure is going to go up, and that's what smart cities is about, right? It's using technology to measure something in order to optimize it. We have to be very careful what we measure, because you might end up optimizing something which, although was a very good thing to optimize in LA, or Austin, or San Francisco, or Paris, might end up being the worst possible thing to optimize in Cork, or London, or Brussels, or Amsterdam, or wherever. So I can see a privacy backlash from being sold stuff, especially in the middle of a financial crisis where it suddenly becomes a bit distasteful, but also an open data backlash in terms of optimizing the wrong thing, and that can fundamentally change a culture, and that's something that needs to be a wider conversation. But you can't have that wider conversation until you've told people what smart cities are, and that's why you have to have that sort of translation thing that I was trying to talk about.
Anybody else? No. No takers. I'm just one here.
Hi, it's another question for Ben. Is there anything you've seen from your experience in working with the Silicon Roundabout in London that you think we should be taking to a region and optimising in Cork?
Yeah. So just for those of you who don't know, I'm the Prime Minister's ambassador to Tech City, which is the government's name for Silicon Roundabout, because they couldn't call it Silicon Roundabout because it sounds like we're taking the piss too much. Which, anyway. I would say that it's the reason that Silicon Roundabout as an area, it's around Old Street in Shoreditch in London, became a cluster naturally was because it was very cheap and rough. A slightly dodgy area and lots of artists and, theatres and dancers and graffiti artists and DJs and, pop-up restaurants. Just other cultural stuff happened, and so it became a really interesting place where everybody could feed off each other. And I think the fundamental strength of a cluster, of a creative cluster, is its multiplicity, is its sort of the fact that you can be a software company in an office above a theatre company, above a brothel, next to a good pub, with a dodgy kebab shop in the corner, and feed off each other, quite literally in some cases. The kebab shop, come on. In a way which makes it a sustainable community rather than a big office park. And I think around the world, if you look at all of the creative clusters which have had a longevity of longer than 20 years, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and become self-fulfilling, become self-renewing, then it has to be mixed use. You have to take the IT cluster and mix it in with people who you would never otherwise talk to. You have to have the painters and the bad artists and the terrible theatre and the really good dancers and you have to have other stuff. Otherwise, as soon as you're hit by a downturn, it becomes a ghost town. And also, there's no reason to go there unless you're really, really, really into being in the office. And people who are really, really, really into being in the office don't make a great creative company. And so knowledge work, in that respect, has to make something that they can answer more.
Right. Like there's an opportunity right now, I think, to create space in Cork with some of the downturn, some of the uses going on. But for God's sake, let's not square off 100,000 metres and call it an IT centre. So, just a thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. People have to mix, and you have to mix just for lifestyle and for mental health and things like that, but also, which I think is a very important thing. One of the things that we haven't paid much attention to is the mental health of our employees, but also just for extra creative input. You know, gather together all the people who make wacky stuff and stick them all in. You know, if you've got spare office space,
most of them are here.
oh, well, okay. But you know, if you've got spare space, for example, you know, and if you've got half of an office floor or something that isn't doing anything, rent it out to some lunatics, but not in your industry. You know, share a coffee machine with a theatre company. They'll be grateful. You know, it's cold outside. They'll be grateful for a warm room to sit in, and you'll have the synergies that you won't be able to predict will be very, very, very useful. Very useful. The only greenfield IT cluster that ever worked was Silicon Valley, and that was for completely different reasons. Well, because it was next to 3 universities and lots and lots of military funding. But everywhere else where they tried to build like an out-of-town office park, horrible. Horrible.
I encourage this very much. I think we're really onto something. I think that in the last year, 2 years, this cluster group, business hub, whatever you want to call it, has evolved. I think there was an element of getting a bit of structure that was needed, and whether they call it a cluster or not, I hear your point, in order to get your act together, as it were, and have common themes and goals and thoughts and start to network within each other. And we're now, I think, in a point in the cycle where now that it's formalized, when we need to do more of what you're saying. And we'll think about that more and more. I think we've got some good things established, and now it is time to globalize more with non-IT folks, governments, academia, other industries, things of that nature. And I think that'll produce, besides that it's fun, and produce new ideas and meet new people. I think it'll create new markets for all of us that we can capture and drive that quid pro quo that we all want to see. Get business, do something right socially, and have fun. So I support this fully.
The other thing, to just add to that very briefly, is that I think if there's one thing that we can see from just web, you know, internet level technologies over the past few years is that they change so quickly as to be fundamentally unpredictable. I mean, you know, 6 years ago, the iPhone didn't exist. And it was like this mythical thing that was going to happen one day, and is now an inordinately huge business. And you know, 8 years ago, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, none of those existed. They're now huge. And so anybody making 10-year plans based on a sort of monoculture is like, unless they're extraordinarily lucky, is liable to die. So you have to sort of take lessons from nature in many ways and create as fertile a place as possible. A place where you can make as many connections with other industries and with other social and creative types as possible. In the same way as like the best forests are the ones that are massively weird and complex rather than monocultures. Simply because that's the most rational thing to do. The most rational thing to do in the face of permanent weirdness is to be weird, really, really weird yourself. You know, weirdness is a competitive advantage.